Good morning, everybody. This is the Mack Road Church of Christ Sunday Acts study. We're starting in Acts 22 and verse 17. All the information you need to know is on the screen in order for you to contact us. And we're glad you're here. Pray the good Lord blesses you for having been here. Remember that we're on Paul's really what they call his fourth missionary journey, although you might actually call it his first imprisonment. Remember that he was in Jerusalem and they sought to kill him because they accused him of bringing Gentiles into the temple, and therefore he was arrested, and a plot arose to try to kill him. And so the commander took him and brought him to Caesarea, where he could be tried there and be safer. And so that's where we're at. We're at Paul, and he's here in Caesarea, and he is being examined at this time. And we're right in the middle of that examination. Paul has just finished talking about his conversion up here in Acts 22 and verses 1 through 16. And he talks about the fact that Ananias came to him and that he baptized him, calling on the name of the Lord. And so therefore, Paul became a Christian, and he gave his testimony of how he went from being a persecutor of the church to being someone who actually became persecuted because he understood that Jesus really was raised from the dead, was really ruling and king, and therefore he changed his position and lost all of his prestige in the Jewish community and really in the Gentile community as well. And so he lost all of his prestige. He basically lost all of his money and all of his property because he talks about himself being poor and not having stuff and having to work with his own hands. And so whatever possessions or whatever property he might have had before was lost to him as a result of him becoming a Christian. And so he's arrested and he's in chains because of the accusations made by those who claim that he was bringing some Gentiles into the temple, and they tried to kill him, and then the commander came and rescued him. And so we're here as he's giving his defense, that he's talking to them, and he's talking to the crowd. Now, as he's talking to the crowd in Jerusalem, he's talking to them about the fact that he too is a Jew, he too is an Israelite, he too is a follower of the Old Testament, he too believes those things. And so therefore, rather than them accusing him, they should actually understand that he would never do such a thing. Now, verse 17, now remember, he's talking about his conversion here. When he was converted, remember, he was going to Damascus for the purpose of bringing bound Christians. And when he did that, verse 17 says, "It happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I fell into a trance. And I saw him saying to me, 'Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me.'" Now, when it speaks about him, when he returned to Jerusalem, it's talking about when he returned from going to Damascus and the events that happened immediately after that at Damascus. He then finally returns to Jerusalem after he'd become a Christian, and no doubt the rumors of him had spread everywhere. And so it says, "It happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I fell into a trance. And I saw him saying to me, 'Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me.' And I said, 'Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another, I used to imprison and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I also was standing by approving and watching out for the coats of those who were slaying him. And he said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles.'" So as he's telling them of his history, you might say, and how he became a believer, he points out that he returned to Jerusalem. Remember, he was in Damascus when he saw the vision. And so therefore, when he returns, after no doubt everybody heard that he had become a believer, rather than persecuting the church, he actually preached for them and actually defended the fact that Jesus was the Messiah. And so it says that as he was praying in the temple, that he fell into a trance. So again, I want you to notice that he says he was praying in the temple. And so he's somebody who respects the temple. He sees it as a place where of worship, where you can go and if I can say it this way, be close to God, or at least it acknowledges the fact that he acknowledges the fact that it's a religious place. So he wouldn't desecrate it if it's the place where he goes to pray. Remember, that's his whole discussion here, because he's preaching to those Jews who had arrested him and had beaten him, and the commander came down and rescued him, and he's standing on the stairs as the army is taking him back to the barracks. And it says, and so he was in a trance, and he says, and I saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. So the Lord appears to Paul and tells Paul to make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they'll not accept his testimony about me. So Paul's intention was to go to Jerusalem and preach to them. And no doubt he thought to himself, if I go to Jerusalem, they know who I am. They know what I used to do. And when I tell them the reason why I was converted and became a Christian, certainly they would accept his testimony. But the Lord says that they would not accept the testimony about me. Now, Jesus made the statement, a prophet is not without honor, except in his own town and in his own family. And so that's an example of what you see here. Rather than them looking at Paul as somebody who was truly converted as a Christian and really believed, they saw him as an enemy now. And rather than accept his message, they thought he was lying, or maybe even if they didn't think he was lying, they were trying to get rid of him, because he was preaching that Jesus was the Christ, was raised from the dead, and was sitting at God's right hand, ruling and reigning. And so he says that the Lord appeared to him and said, get out. So apparently he hadn't started preaching yet, but he says they're not going to receive your testimony. Verse 19 says, and I said, Lord, they themselves understood that in one synagogue after another, I used to imprison and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I also was standing by approving and watching out for the coats of those who were slaying him. So, like I just mentioned, when he said, and I say, Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another used to imprison and beat those who believed in you. The reason that he's saying this is because he's trying to get them to understand that he was exactly like they were, the crowd that he's talking to, that he was zealous for the law, and even so zealous that he would persecute Christians even to foreign cities. And he even says, and that when Stephen was stoned, he was actually approving of it, and he was he was guarding the coats of those people who were going to slay him, because you certainly don't want to get blood splattered on your coats. And so they left all their coats with Paul as they began to stone Stephen. And of course, you can find that event in Acts chapter 7. And so Paul is reminding them that even from an early life, he was persecuting them. Now, the reason he's telling them that is because he's trying to get them to understand that he was persecuting the church. And no doubt he was going to tell them that now he changed, or at least he already told them that he changed. And so therefore they need to understand that he's not going to defile the temple, but he's also has seen the Lord, and that they should believe him. Now, verse 21 says that after he made the statement about to Jesus about him imprisoning Christians and also being part of the death of Stephen, that Jesus said to him, and he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And right there, at that message, at that word, his sermon ended. And his sermon ended because verse 22 says they listened up to this statement, and then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. Now, he hadn't said anything that would cause them to want to kill him, or that was deserving of the death penalty. There was nothing. The thing that bothered them was he used the word Gentiles. And to the Jews, the Gentiles were lower class people who were only going to be saved by the ruling class of the Jewish community, who was going to rule, and therefore the Gentiles would be saved by the rule of the Jewish community. And so they always viewed themselves as superior to the Gentiles. And not only that, but they had accused Paul of bringing a Gentile into the temple. And so when he said, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles, they stopped listening to him, and his sermon ended. Now, I want us to understand something. I heard somebody say that I don't know if it was Paul's intention to actually say this or not. Well, one of the things that I believe is that when the apostles would preach, they were inspired. Not just by the idea that they had a message that was really from God, but I mean, they were inspired. They were individuals who were speaking for God, and God inspired them. And as recorded in Matthew chapter 10, they were given at the very moment that they were arrested or that they were under trial, they would be given the very things to say. He says here in Matthew 10 and verse 16, he says, but I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, and so be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will hand you over to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues, and you will even be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. But when they hand you over, do not worry about how or what you are to say, for it will be given you in that hour what you are to say. For it is not you who speak, but it's the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. And so he points out that they're going to be given the very message to say. They're going to be given the very words to say. And so there was no mistake here that Paul was making. It was the Holy Spirit that was actually directing him. And so therefore, when we understand it that way, one of the things that this shows us is it shows us the attitude of the Jewish community. And it shows you their arrogance when it came to the Gentiles and their hatred of them. And so it's setting up, you might say, the understanding of their destruction and why God rejected them as his people and destroyed them in 70 AD. And so that's part of, I'd suggest to you, of why he said that. But he was just going through and he was just telling them the message that God had put into his heart. Now, verse 22. It says, they listened to him up to this statement, and then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. And as they were crying out and throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging, so that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. But when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and told him, saying, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman. The commander came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman? And he said, yes. The commander answered, I acquired the citizenship with a large sum of money. And Paul said, I was actually born a citizen. Therefore, those who were about to examine him immediately let go of him. And the commander also was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had put him in chains. And so as the writer is speaking, as Luke is recording this, Luke records that the Jewish community, remember that he's at the temple or in the temple area, and he's on the stairway leading up to the barracks, and he's preaching to the mob that was down there trying to kill him. And when he said the word Gentiles, it says they listened to him up to this statement, and then they raised their voice and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. And so just because of his statement, they said away with him, and he should not be allowed to live. He's telling them the truth, and yet they're saying that he shouldn't be allowed to live. And the reason he shouldn't be allowed to live is because he's taking the side of the Gentiles. But the kingdom of God was supposed to be for everybody. If you remember the promise that was given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 3, it said that through your seed, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So God's intention was always to save the whole entire world and give them an opportunity to be saved and a way to be saved. And that was coming through the Jewish community, which was the reason why God worked with the Jews for all those centuries, was in order to bring about the body of Jesus, who had to be a Jew, because he made a promise to Abraham and he made a promise to David about his physical family. But God's intention was always to save the Gentiles. But the Jewish community, as I pointed out, had become arrogant and had become proud, and they had become self-righteous, and they thought they were the ones that were going to be blessed. And the Jewish community, the Gentile community, if blessed, was going to be blessed as a result of them being blessed. Now, verse 23 says, "And as they cried out and threw off their cloaks and tossed dust into the air," and so here you see how they're acting. They're basically acting like spoiled brats or a mob, and that, that's exactly what's going on here. So they're throwing dust into the air, and they were crying out, away with him, throwing dust in the air. And the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging, so that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. So apparently, either the commander didn't get enough information from the sermon, or the commander didn't know Hebrew, because Paul was preaching to them in Hebrew. If you remember, when he started speaking to them in Hebrew, they all quieted down. It's possible that the commander didn't know Hebrew, because he might have just been stationed there from some other part of the country, and certainly not a Jew. And so therefore, he wasn't sure what was being said. And if he didn't know what was being said, he was confused as to why in the world they would want to persecute Paul or kill him, simply because of the story that he's telling. But either way, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging, so that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him in that way. And so the commander wanted to find out more information. And the way you find out more information is by, according to the Roman method of interrogation, is you scourge them or flog them. And so if they don't answer you properly, or they don't answer you with what they believe is the truth, then you'll get scourged. And the more you don't answer, the more they scourge you. And so it's kind of like waterboarding people. And I know there was a big to-do about waterboarding, but those kind of practices have gone on for a very long time. And I'm not endorsing them. I'm just simply saying that that's one of the things that civil people, magistrates and commanders and armies do for the purpose of trying to get information. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's exactly what they're doing with Paul, and it's something that has gone on through history. And so anyway, so they were scourging him, and they might find out the reason. But when they stretched him out with thongs, because the way they would flog you is they would wrap you around a pole, or tie your hands to a place where they could expose your back, and then the person flogging you would have access to your whole back. And so they would tie your arms, kind of like if you were crucified, but yet they would tie them. They wouldn't use nails. And so they were getting ready to scourge him. And it says, but when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" So Paul here turns to the centurion and says, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a Roman?" And verse 26 says, when the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and told him, saying, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman. Now, the reason for that is because there are certain rights if you're a Roman citizen, just like there are certain rights if you're an American citizen. You have certain rights that other people don't have, and aliens don't have when they get here. Some people want to give all the rights of an American, of a U.S. citizen, to everybody who just steps foot in the country, and they don't have those rights. The only ones who have those rights are those who are citizens of the United States. And so, for example, we have the fact that we have to have a trial by jury, that we have to, they can't seize our property without proper procedure. We have the right of freedom of speech, or at least we used to. That's starting to go away. But when Paul says that he's a Roman, what he's really saying is, you're getting ready to flog a Roman, and I haven't been tried. It's illegal to flog a Roman without charging him or without trying him and without having him found guilty. Matter of fact, if you scourged or hurt a Roman citizen, then the Roman government would actually give you the same consequences that you gave to them, and you would certainly be punished and you would lose your position. So he says it's lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned. Of course, the answer is no, it's not. Now, what's interesting is back over in Acts chapter 16, Paul willingly allowed those people to beat him. If you remember with the events of the Philippian jailer, Paul ended up in prison after he was beat. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why in the world there did he allow them to beat him before he told them he was a Roman? He did tell them that he was a Roman, if you remember, but he told them at the end of chapter 16, when the jailer was informed by the civil authorities or by the city officials that Paul could be freed and let go, Paul told him to tell them that he's a Roman and that they beat him uncondemned, and so he's not just going to walk out. They have to come and take him out. Now, it's interesting that Paul does that, and I'm sure the reason why Paul does that is because it gives him more leverage when it comes to them, his work and the work of the church there that's going to continue as Paul leaves. Is going to be able to help them, and they're going to be able to be more respectable, you might say, or at least the city officials will be more cautious about bothering them. Or maybe Paul knew that the Philippian jailer was going to acknowledge Jesus and be saved. But either way, it's interesting that at that time, Paul allowed himself to be beat. We have no record of Paul saying, I'm a Roman, until the very end. And we know they respected Roman authority because they were considered a Roman city. But here, Paul says, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman? So apparently here, Paul had a different thing in mind. And so he told them that he was a Roman. Now it says, when the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and told him, saying, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman. So he really is a Roman, and he comes, and the guard standing by, the centurion standing by, came and talked with the commander. Now notice, every time in the book of Acts that you hear about a centurion, it's always, he's always represented honestly. He's always represented justly. He's never represented as somebody who's cruel or mean. Now, maybe they were, but a centurion generally was not. He was a man of integrity, and he was a man who wanted justice and who wanted Roman law upheld. And Roman law, one of the primary purposes for Roman law was to administer peace, so that the country would be in peace and not have any civil unrest. And so it's interesting that in this particular case, the Romans were the ones who were really seeking for justice, and the Jewish community, those who were supposed to uphold justice, were the ones who didn't want it. They're the ones who were just looking to condemn Paul in a mob trial. And so it says, when the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and told him, saying, what are you about to do? For this man is Roman, verse 27. The commander came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman? And he said, yes. The commander answered, I acquired the citizenship with a large sum of money. And Paul says, but I was actually born a citizen. So the commander comes and he asks Paul about whether he's a citizen or not. And Paul says that he was. And he said, yes. Now, what I find interesting is that the commander believed Paul when he said that he was a Roman citizen. I don't think Paul carried around an identification card that identified him as a Roman citizen, but the commander believed him. And it's interesting that the commander believed him that he was a Roman, or maybe we should say that he was at least fearful that if he was, he didn't want to take any chances. And of course, if it was found out that Paul was not a Roman, then certainly he would bear the consequences of pretending that he was. But the commander answered and said, I acquired the citizenship with a large sum of money. It's kind of like a friend that I have. His name is Dave, and he's from Argentina. And he came over here on a visa, and then he ended up staying. And so he was for the last, probably 20 years trying to become a United States citizen. And he would tell me about all the steps he had to go through and the money he had to pay and the lawyers that he had to get in order for him to become a citizen. He finally became a citizen, and he was extremely happy that he's an American citizen. So even he acquired it, but he acquired it with a large sum of money and a long time. The centurion acquired his with a large sum of money. And Paul says, but I was actually born a citizen. And that's like me. I was born a citizen. I was born here. Some of my grandparents, some of my great-grandparents weren't born here, but when they came here and they acquired citizenship here, then their children would be citizens. And so I am now a citizen, even though I have Mexican ancestry in me. And so he points out in verse 29, or it points out, therefore those who were about to examine him immediately let go of him. And the commander also was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had put him in chains. So Paul is identified as a Jew, and he's identified as a Roman. And it's interesting that the Roman community treats him better than the Jewish community does. And that's a stark example of the difference between a group of individuals who are religiously zealous without understanding the nature of law, and the civil authorities that are trying to enforce general law for the purpose of promoting purity, for promoting peace. And so that's really interesting in that dialogue. Now, verse 30 says, but on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble, and brought Paul down and set him before them. Now, when it says, on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him. That doesn't mean that the commander let Paul go. It means that the commander untied him from his bindings that he had put on him. And so therefore he ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble and brought Paul down and set him before them. So he was gonna try to find out what was actually going on. And so that brings us to chapter 23. And so here in chapter 23, we have Paul not standing before the Jewish community in the temple, but actually in a courtroom, in the place where they would meet for the purpose of hearing trials and judging people's verdicts. And so this was a civil court. You might also notice the contrast between the Jewish court and the civil court. In the civil court, it's more civil. In the Jewish religious court, they were a mob, and they wanted to do everything to kill Paul without actually giving him the proper trial or even the proper witnesses and examining them. So here we are in chapter 23 and verse 1, as Paul is going to give his defense in front of the council. Now, verse 1 says, and we'll read a little bit and then we'll come back and talk about it. Verse 1 says, Paul, looking intently at the council, said, brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law? In violation of the law, order me to be struck? But the bystanders said, Do you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I was not aware, brethren, that he was high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of the people. But perceiving that one group was Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope and the resurrection of the dead. As he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. And there occurred a great uproar, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, we find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. And as a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. But on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also. And so here we have this trial that is being overseen by the commander of the army in order to find out what's going on. And like I pointed out, notice the difference between the Jewish method of administering the law and the Roman method. And the Romans were trying to promote peace and keep peace. But as you see in this reading that we just read, the Jewish community was only concerned about one thing, and that was their party spirit. And that's a really sad thing. And that's one of the reasons why the Jewish people as a nation were rejected by God, which is, by the way, what's happening in our country today. We're starting to get these political parties, and one party won't talk to the other party, and it's going to create problems for the United States, and we're going to have great difficulty. But anyway, in Acts 23:1, it says, Paul, looking intently at the council, said, so this is the next day, and he's at the council, and this would be more of a Jewish council than a Gentile council, but the commander and the army was overseeing it. And so it says, and the reason for that was because the commander wanted to know what was going on. So it says, brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. And I want to stop here and think about this for just a minute, because it says Paul said that he's lived a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. So how in the world can that be, that he's lived this perfectly good conscience before God, if he was running around killing Christians or persecuting Christians, and he was putting Stephen to death? I mean, how does somebody with a perfectly good conscience do that? How in the world would that happen? And the answer is that a perfectly good conscience isn't talking about the morality of the conscience. It's talking about the activity of the conscience. In other words, a conscience is given to us for the purpose of helping us make right decisions in those areas that we believe are right. See, if you have a good conscience and you believe it's wrong to steal, your good conscience will tell you it's wrong. Now, if you have a good conscience and you've been taught all your life by your parents that it's okay to take an apple from the store and eat it in the store if you want, and so you'll take an apple and you'll eat it, and you'll do it with a perfectly good conscience. Your conscience will not tell you that you're doing something wrong, because the information your conscience has is that it's okay to do that. And so since Paul thought that it was proper for him to persecute Christians, and that it was proper for them to stone Stephen, because according to the Old Testament law, if an individual was preaching a different God, they were supposed to be stoned. And so when Stephen was stoned, Paul did it with a good conscience. If Paul was there helping out, and he thought that Stephen was doing good and yet he helped them kill him, then he would have a bad conscience. So when Paul says, I've lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day, that's what he has reference to. In other words, he has reference to the fact that he's always done what he believes to be the right thing. And that's the mark of a person of integrity. A person of integrity, you might say, doesn't always do everything right, but he always does everything that he believes is right. That's a man of integrity. And when that man of integrity changes his information or his knowledge, then it's also going to change his actions accordingly. And so therefore, when Paul saw Jesus on the road to Damascus, understood that the information he previously had was wrong, and that Jesus really was raised from the dead, and that Jesus really was ruling and alive. Therefore, his perfectly good conscience would change his mind. That's also what's under consideration in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 16, where it's talking about the example of Noah and how Noah was saved in the ark. But it's really an example of, it's really an example, excuse me, of sanctifying Jesus. In 1 Peter 3 and verse 14, this isn't about Noah. We'll get to the one about Noah in just a minute. Sorry about that. Oh yeah, it is down to verse 20. But verse 14 says, but even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidations, and do not be troubled. But sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart. So there's the information. The information is Jesus, Lord of our heart. Always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. So Peter is saying that the information Christians have is Jesus, Lord, and that we therefore make a defense, and we speak with gentleness and reverence. And it says, and keep a good conscience, so that in the things in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. So a good conscience here renders good behavior. If you are a Christian, you're supposed to have good behavior. And good behavior up here, as he pointed out, was that we suffer for Christ. We're willing to suffer for what is good, as Paul was doing, if you have a good conscience. But if your conscience is bad, you will give into comfort, or you'll give into life preservation in order for you to stay alive, rather than have sanctified Christ as Lord. He says, for it is better if God should will it so that you suffer for doing what is right rather than for doing what is wrong. For Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which also he went and made proclamation to the spirits in prison, who once were disobedient, when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is eight persons, were brought safely through the water. And corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience. There it is right there. See, an appeal to God for a good conscience. In other words, when we understand that we're sinners, and when we understand that there's going to be condemnation coming on sinners, and we want to do right, we're people of integrity, then we're going to be baptized like Noah, who was a man of integrity, and the people who entered the ark with him were characters of integrity, that they entered the ark because they knew that a flood was coming. And so those of us who get baptized in Jesus are baptized not for the purpose of removing dirt from the flesh, but it's the appeal, it's the answer for a good conscience. In other words, that we have a good conscience, and therefore we're administering that good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus. And so he's gonna make our conscience good, because we're gonna have our sins forgiven, because we know that we've done something wrong. And so therefore it is a good conscience that we have. So that's what's under consideration over here with Paul in Acts 23 and verse 1, when it says, but Paul, looking intently at the council, said, brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience up to this day. Sorry, checking something. In a perfectly good, up to this day. Now, verse 2, the high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Now, why would Ananias, the high priest, command those to strike him? Well, maybe he thought he was being smart, or maybe he thought he was being sarcastic, or he just couldn't believe that Paul actually thought that he's lived a perfectly good conscience before God, because they're accusing him of lying. They're accusing him of bringing Gentiles into the temple. They're accusing him of doing everything that would indicate that he hasn't been keeping a good conscience. Now, I want you to understand something. Me keeping a good conscience has nothing to do with anybody else around me. Has nothing to do with what other people think about me. Has nothing to do with what other people think about what I'm doing. Having a perfectly good conscience means that I am keeping true to my conscience and the information that I have, no matter what other people are doing. Other people might be sinning and carrying on, but if I have a good conscience and I believe it's wrong, then I'm not going to do what they do simply because society permits it. It's kind of like the way that people are today when it comes to this stupid thing about people getting to pick their own gender, and that whole philosophy goes against the truth and goes against what God teaches. God taught there was only two genders, and that's all that there are. And so if I have a perfectly good conscience, I am going to uphold that standard, no matter what people might say, no matter what our government might dictate, no matter what society might command. Now, I'm not going to be rude or mean to individuals that are in sin and that don't see things, don't see the truth, but I'm also not going to give in just so that they like me, or so that I don't lose anything. For example, if you lose something because of work, or if you lose, you end up being thrown in prison. It kind of reminds me of that individual who refused to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple, and they basically ruined him because of it. Well, he had a perfectly good conscience. He was staying faithful to his conscience. But as a result of that, and the reason I'm saying this is because as a result of that, the community is going to react, just like the high priest reacted. The high priest couldn't believe that Paul had a perfectly good conscience, especially when he said a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. And so the high priest struck him. Now, and said to strike him on the mouth. Now, verse 3 says, then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? So Paul points out that the activity of striking him before actually hearing his defense and charging him with a crime and finding him guilty, it was against the law, and especially if he was a Roman. And so one of the things that this shows you is that this trial was not a trial that was going to seek for justice. Like I told you when I began this chapter, that the Roman method of trial was certainly a lot more judicial and carried a lot more justice to it than the Jewish community. When they would do their trials, they pretty much had their minds all made up before the trial came. And so it was just simply nothing more than a facade. And that's the same thing with Jesus. They had already decided to kill him and put him to death, wanting him to die, when they came and brought him to Pilate. And because Pilate didn't find anything wrong with him, Herod didn't find anything wrong with him, nobody found anything wrong with him, but the Jews wanted him killed. And that's this same group of people here. So it's not just a certain group in Israel. It was pretty much the way the whole group was, and they willingly went along with it, and that's true in America. The government can pass a law, but if people don't like it, they're not going to do it. But if people are more concerned about their own personal comfort or their own personal security, then they might give in to the government, and the government will be able to do whatever it is that they're allowed to do by the people, because the people are the ones who give the government the power to do what the government does. And so this stuff that's going on in our country today is happening because the people want it to happen. And so you need to understand that we're not like them. So Paul is accusing him of being struck and being tried and not according to the law. And so that's certainly something that we struggle with today. You know, we have certain freedoms in our Constitution, and some individuals try to take those away, and yet it rests on the Constitution. And until they change the Constitution, there are people going to be fighting about those rights that they have. And so that's what you see going on here. Paul said, but do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? So Paul knew he wasn't going to get a fair trial. But Paul knew that this was just a mock trial. Now verse 4 says, but the bystander said, do you revile God's high priest? In other words, you're not supposed to speak against your rulers or against your leaders. You're not supposed to speak against them. You're supposed to respect your leaders. And so by Paul saying that, he seemed to be disrespecting the ruler. Now, notice what Paul said. The only thing that he said was, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? Now Jesus told the Jews that they were, that the Pharisees, that they were whitewashed tombs. Over in Matthew 23 and verse 27, he said, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. So that term, whitewashed wall, indicated somebody who looked good on the outside, but the inside was corrupt. And that's what Paul's pointing out. So it wasn't so much a disrespectful statement as much as it was a statement of identity of how Paul viewed his judge, the person that was going to judge him in this trial. And so it says, the bystander says, do you revile God's high priest? And Paul says, I was not aware that he was God's high priest. So Paul points out that he wasn't aware that he was God's high priest. Okay, in Exodus 22 and verse 28, it says, you shall not curse God, nor curse a ruler of your people. And so that's what it says. Boy, wouldn't that be an amazing thing to do today? Everybody's cursing our president. Everybody's speaking evil of him. And that's one of the reasons, is because we have no respect in our country anymore. Nobody respects, people don't have respect for each other. People don't have respect for women. They don't have respect for children. They don't have respect for policemen. They don't have respect for teachers. And they don't have respect for anybody. And so as respect breaks down, you're going to see the breakdown of our culture. And that happens because the very first person that we should respect is God. If you don't respect God, you're not going to respect anybody else. And so therefore, the Old Testament taught that you're supposed to respect your rulers. And so Paul says, well, I was not aware, brethren, that he was high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now, that's an interesting statement. It says, Paul said, I was not aware, brethren, that he was high priest, for it is written. Now, how is it that Paul didn't know he was high priest? Apparently, it seems that the high priest would be sitting in a place of honor. If you remember, that's what they did. The high priest would be sitting in a place of honor. He would have some robes or some dress. He would be dressed in a way that would present him as the high priest. And so for Paul to say, I did not know, I was not aware, brethren, that he was high priest, it's possible that Paul means that literally, that he didn't know he was high priest. Maybe the high priest was wearing his everyday clothes as opposed to his official robes. I kind of doubt it. But probably more than likely, Paul was simply pointing out that if he's high priest, he is not the caliber or quality of people that should be high priest. He says, I was not aware, brethren, that he was high priest, for it is written. So it could be that Paul is simply pointing out that he would be surprised if he was high priest because he judges people not fairly or according to the proper law. But Paul nonetheless says that he knows the law. You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So Paul admits the fact that he's not supposed to speak evil of his people. Now, at this very moment, Paul understood something about the council. The council wasn't there to give him a fair trial. They already struck him contrary to the law. So they didn't care about the law. They were simply concerned about trying to get rid of Paul, is what they were concerned about. And so verse 6 says, but perceiving that one group was Sadducee and the other Pharisee, Paul began crying out in the council, brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope and the resurrection of the dead. And so Paul, noticing that the crowd were Sadducees and Pharisees, I'm not sure exactly how he could tell, maybe by the clothes they wore, or as I mentioned before, the Holy Spirit is doing this and has Paul's mouth. And so therefore the Holy Spirit knew that there were Sadducees and Pharisees, and knew that Paul was not going to get a fair trial, and didn't want Paul to be executed at this time. That also might explain down here in verse 11, where it says, but on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also. So the Holy Spirit, knowing that Paul had to witness in Rome, would not allow Paul to get in a situation where he would be killed. And so therefore, verse 6 says, but perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul cried out, brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of the Pharisee. I'm on trial for the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Now, I find this interesting, especially today in our culture, where some people have the view that that if somebody is from a different denomination, that somehow they're not acceptable to God, or they're not as saved, if I can put it that way. I'm not sure exactly how to put it, but they're kind of, one denomination looks down at another denomination because they're from a different denomination. But what's interesting here is that I find that Paul says, brethren, I am a Pharisee. Now, Paul didn't say, I used to be a Pharisee. Paul said, I'm a Pharisee. So apparently he still holds to some of the Pharisaical traditions, you might say, and yet there is no reprimand of God telling Paul, you shouldn't tell people you're a Pharisee, you shouldn't tell people you're a Christian. And though I believe that we should just be Christians, if somebody says, well, I'm a Christian who is Calvinist, or I'm a Christian who is Baptist, or I'm a Christian who is Methodist, or whatever, I don't necessarily see that as being sinful unless you cause division as a result of it. unless you say everybody has to be a Baptist, or everybody has to be a Methodist, or everybody has to be a Pentecostal. And so therefore, when you do that, that's what causes division. I think that's what Paul meant in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, when he says there's divisions among you. He wasn't saying, well, some of you say you're Pharisees and some of you say you're Sadducees, but you get along and you help each other and you do what's right, and you're both trying to get to heaven, and you're both trying to do what God says, and you just have some different ideas on some things. Paul didn't say that. Paul said there's division. He says you're dividing because of it. Somebody who says that they're a follower of Peter is divided from somebody who says they're a follower of Apollos. And so there's this division instead of people understanding that that to be a follower of Jesus sometimes means that we find some good teaching in some places, and so we'll reside there for a while. And sometimes we'll find a better teaching at another place, and we'll reside there for a while. And it's not so much the place where we reside as it is the person that we believe. So Paul was a believer, but yet he said, brethren, I am a Pharisee. So he's telling them that he's a Pharisee. He says, a son of a Pharisee. I'm on trial for the hope and the resurrection of the dead. So as a Pharisee, Paul understood the resurrection of the dead. He says that's why he's on trial. I'm on trial for the resurrection of the dead. So whatever group somebody belongs to, you might say, what matters is are you on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead? In other words, are you a believer in Jesus and trying to do his will and trying to learn what he wants you to do? And are you living in all good conscience according to what your conscience says and according to what your conscience does? And if you find certain things that in your religion that your conscience will not allow you to do, well, then you might need to change, and you might need to find a place that's more in tune with what you believe the scriptures teach and your conscience will allow you to accept. And so I'd suggest to you that that's one of the things that we see here, because Paul says, I am a Pharisee. He didn't say I was a Pharisee. He says I am a Pharisee. So apparently a Christian can be a Pharisee. And why is that? Because the Pharisees believe on the trial for the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Now, did the Pharisees believe everything right? No. They had some problems in their belief, but Paul could apparently be a Pharisee and still be faithful to God as he puts his hope in the resurrection of the dead. In other words, he puts his hope in Jesus. And it says, as he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So here you see the party spirit. Here's the party spirit. And again, I want you to notice this. Paul's on trial. They're trying to figure out whether Paul is guilty or innocent of a crime, right? And so Paul says, oh, by the way, look, there's Sadducees and Pharisees, and I'm a Pharisee. And he said, and as he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees as the assembly was divided. All you have to do today in our country, you want to cause division, is just say, I'm a Republican, or I'm a Democrat, or I'm an independent. And everybody who's from a different party will argue with you, whether they know what you're saying or not, whether they give you a chance to talk or not. It's interesting that as soon as you tell somebody what party you're from, all of a sudden their attitude changes towards you. And that's that party spirit that's under consideration. That's when denominations become wrong. They become wrong when one party looks at another party and says that party's not making it to heaven because they're not doing everything right like we're doing everything right. And so therefore they can't get there, but we're going to get there because we're doing everything right. Don't misunderstand that. That doesn't mean that there isn't a right and wrong. Yes, there is. But I'm talking about honest, true, sincere Christians that are trying to do what God says. That's what I'm talking about. And so here, however, you have this party spirit. The assembly was divided, and there was a division that occurred between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. Well, why? Well, look at verse 8. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So here's part of their division. part of their division is that the Sadducees believe one thing, the Pharisees believe another thing, and it has to do with the resurrection. And so certainly it would be difficult for you to be a Sadducee who doesn't believe in the resurrection and believe in Jesus. So, I mean, that's incongruent. That certainly would not be acceptable. It's kind of like saying, well, I am a Buddhist Christian. Well, you can't be both of those. There's some philosophies that don't fit with being a Christian. And so either you're a Christian or you're not. Now, what camp you camp with is another thing as you're learning and as you're trying to figure out what God says. But remember that Jesus has one church. He has one group of people, and that one group of people are the people who serve him and follow him no matter what. So it says, for the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angels, nor spirits, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees are divided, and they're divided on this idea of the supernatural. You have the Sadducees that we would consider in our day individuals who look at the Bible as if it's a good story, has good practices that people should do, but it's really not for us today. And the stories that are in it are all, they're myths, and those things really didn't happen. And then you have the other side of the coin, where you have individuals that believe that there are angels, that there are spirits, that there is the supernatural, that there is the spirit world, that there is resurrection. And so you have those two groups. And so they're in contrast with one another. And certainly that's a proper place to have a division. But for individuals to divide because one group believes they can eat in the building and another group doesn't believe they can eat in the building, or one group believes you can have a building and another group believes you can't have a building, but they're both trusting and trying to do what they believe Jesus wants them to do, is not the reason for division. But this is, because the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, no angels, and no spirits. The Pharisees acknowledge them all. Now, verse 9, and there occurred a great uproar. And some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, we find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. So again, I want you to notice that they come to try out, to give Paul a trial. And all of a sudden, when they find out Paul is from a certain party, they throw the trial and all the evidence out of the window and say, he's okay, he's fine, he's one of us. We don't care what he's done. We don't care what's happened. We don't care about the facts. All we care about is that he's one of us. And that's what you have going on here. And there occurred a great uproar, and some of the scribes and some of the Pharisaic party stood up and began arguing heatedly, saying, we find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. And as a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. Now, I told you that the Romans and the Roman commanders and centurions seemed to be more just when it came to civil law and keeping peace than the Jewish community did. Here again, we have this riot that's occurring where they're going to tear Paul apart. Now, what's interesting is that the commander had already tied Paul. It would be a great advantage for the commander if they just killed Paul, because then Paul couldn't say, well, the commander bound me, and the commander would get in trouble. Well, what a great opportunity for the commander to get out of any trouble that he might see himself in. But notice that he didn't do that. Instead, when he finds that Paul is in danger, he sends his soldiers down there, his troops down there, in order to take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. So he was protecting Paul. And that's what you find throughout the New Testament, is that the Roman Empire protected Paul and protected the Christians. But there's going to come a time when the very same people that protected them are going to be the people who end up persecuting them. And I believe that's what the book of Revelation was about. And if you'd like to know more about that, I'm in the process of writing a couple of books about that. And when that's out, I'll let you know. But verse 11 says, but on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, take courage, For as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also. So Paul is on his way to Rome. He's witnessing, and what great opportunities that Paul is given, because now he's witnessing to commanders, he's witnessing to rulers, and that's what we're going to see. He's going to be witnessing to the ruling class of the world. It's very difficult to get a hearing with the ruling class of the world. It's very difficult for that to happen. He has to seek an audience. And so what better way for him to be able to speak to people in political power than as a prisoner who's going to be put on trial over and over and over again as he is charged with the crimes that supposedly they believe that he's done. So, glad you're here. Pray the Lord's blessed you, and pray that you have learned something that will help you be a better servant of His. And pray that you serve, and pray that you live your life in a good conscience towards God, and serve Him and follow Him, and believe in the resurrection of the dead, and understand that Paul was an individual who is one of the greatest examples of, or one of the greatest proofs of the resurrection of Jesus, because some people deny the history of Jesus, but nobody can deny the existence of Paul, because he wrote a bunch of books and a bunch of letters that we have. And yet his story tells us that he went from being a persecutor, being persecuted for the cause of Christ. And there's only one reason why he would do that. That's because he had a good conscience, and therefore when he learned the truth, he changed. And pray that you will too, if you haven't come to know him. Pray God blesses you. Thanks for being here.